the technical definition, of course, is that a rubric is a scoring guide that outlines clear expectations and criteria. There's that beautiful word, criteria, for assessing a specific task, performance, or product. Now, what do we want to produce? Now, when we talk about product here, we're talking about our projects and presentations, and so it's better to use actually rubrics in our projects and presentations for evaluating students. Because it gives them a clear idea of what they did and what they didn't do. At least that's the intention. So it's also like a roadmap detailing what good, average, and below average work looks like. Now, there's different categories that we can call those things. We don't have to call them good, average, and below average. There are other nomenclature that we can use. And so it's what these things look like, whatever we designate those standards of excellence to be. And it also is a clear structure that provides both teachers and students and parents, actually, with a shared understanding of the learning goals and how success will be measured. So again, standards of excellence, at what level are we achieving what we're trying to achieve? Now, of course, we use these sometimes or quite often in order to come up with these number grades as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get further in. So as far as the role of rubrics in assessment goes, rubrics play a very crucial role in the effective assessment by doing these things, promoting transparency and fairness. How does it promote transparency and fairness? Well, because by showing students, showing parents, showing colleagues, showing administration what our expectations are, everything is clear from the very beginning. We don't have to worry about anybody misunderstanding what is expected of them in order to reach a certain level of achievement. It also allows us to provide targeted feedback. When we usually, like if we give 80%, let's say we give a student an 80% grade. A lot of times we have difficulty if we just use these numbers in order to grade them. It can be difficult for us to tell them exactly why they didn't get that other 20%, unless you've been teaching for a while. But then you have in your head you have a set standard to be able to tell them. But when you have a rubric, however, there's just absolutely no question. And you can tell them, look, I'm sorry, but you didn't do this. You did this. This is fine, but you needed to do this other part here as well. And then, of course, they help with supporting self-assessment. Remember that now in the 2020s, we are expecting students, people in general, to be able to self-assess. As we raise these kids into being good members of society, self-assessment is extremely important. And so we want to try to get them used to doing that now. And so having rubrics helps them to get used to self-assessing. They can look at a rubric, know what's expected of them, and then when they get their project or their presentation or whatever the outcome is that is being covered by the rubric, when they get that back, that feedback, then they know, okay, well, I obviously accept this because I can self-assess myself. I know that I belong with this grade. Okay, and it also improves communication and collaboration, obviously, by having clear and transparent and fair rubrics. It's very easy to communicate. And then, of course, with collaboration, everyone's on the same page with what needs to be done. Okay, and then, of course, we have distinct types of rubrics. There are 3 distinct types of rubrics. Today we'll spend a lot of time on analytic rubrics, but there are other kinds of rubrics that I will talk about in a second. With the analytic rubric, we have the criterion, and usually the criteria always goes on the left, as you look at the paper or as you look at the screen. it goes on the left, and then your standards of excellence go across the top. And then, of course, your descriptors for how you meet those standards of excellence go in the rest of the table. So for this instance, with an analytic rubric, you would have something like exceeds expectations. It's clear and detailed description of exemplary performance, and then meets expectations, specific description of satisfactory performance, and then needs improvement. Of course, it's something that needs further development. So, and then you just want to make sure that everything is consistent as far as how you do those, fill in those boxes. Okay, so that's an analytic rubric. And then we also have a holistic rubric. A holistic rubric usually is about how certain things are demonstrated. So, for example, you would have your levels of excellence over on the left, your standards of excellence. So you would have excellent, good, and needs improvement. Something wrong with my lips and my tongue today. And then, of course, the description for how you meet those things goes in, in the boxes. So, for example, with excellent, you would have demonstrates a thorough understanding of the concepts and skills, consistently exceeds expectations, and produces exceptional work that goes beyond the requirements. Now, let me ask you something. When we're using an analytic rubric, we can use analytic rubrics, for example, with just about any learning outcome. When do you think that we would use a holistic rubric? What does a holistic rubric remind you of when you read through this? It would be report card time. So this kind of rubric could go on a report card because it tells a parent and it tells a student where they are as a whole, right? That's what holistic means. Some people spell it with W-H and some H-O-L. It doesn't really matter. It just means as a whole, this is what, this is the level at which the student is. So yeah, it's at those report times. So I would recommend that in your report cards, I'm not going to say anything to anybody else other than you guys, but for your reports, if you send reports home, in addition to the report cards, if you want to, you can include something like this so that the parents have a better understanding of where their kid actually is. I know I would like to see it for my sons, and then we also have developmental rubrics. For developmental rubrics, we can go with developmental stage over on the left. When we do something like this, we can come up with, obviously, you can come up with different wording if you want to, but in this case, we have emerging, developing, proficient, and mastery. And then in what area are they doing this? As far as the description goes, it demonstrates limited understanding of the concepts and skills, often requires significant support and scaffolding. So these descriptions that match these developmental stages, if you decided to use a developmental rubric, those you could probably use as is. You don't have to change those because they're pretty standard. Where you want to focus your attention on is with the possible student work examples, such as makes basic attempts at the task. Which task is it? Well, it's developmental rubric for something. So if you want to have a developmental rubric, you can have these for things such as writing, for essays. You can have it also for your projects. You can have it for your presentations. So it's different items that they would want to work on. How are rubrics used? Well, first of all, we use them for developing assessments so that we can actually differentiate some assessments. So we had an assessment in mind. We had a test in mind, for example, for the midterm. But we have been using rubrics, and we notice that as we're going through that, these kids aren't ready for these questions that I thought ahead of and have ready for the midterm. So I'm going to go ahead and, use some different questions because I don't want them to fail miserably and look like I'm not teaching. I'm going to, maybe change it a little bit, make it challenging, yet not so overwhelming that we know that they're not going to pass. Or we can make it more challenging depending on where they are. The other way is scoring and providing feedback, of course. When it comes to scoring, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we use it obviously to help with marking. Let's say we have to have a certain number of grades that we enter into the system every quarter or semester or every week or whatever. Well, if we use a rubric, we can use it also for scoring, and of course providing feedback. If we're not using rubrics to provide feedback, then that's a problem. What's the point of having a rubric if you're not going to use it for feedback? And then, of course, self-assessment and peer assessment. When a kid has a rubric in front of him, and I'm not talking about kindergarten, first grade, second grade, obviously more along the lines of middle school and high school would qualify for this part. Where they're self-assessing, they can look at the rubric and they can know what they need to do. And a lot of times, kids will use it as goals. They will say, "Hey, I want to get this, so I'm gonna do the best I can to complete this, this box right here." Okay, and then of course we have some pros and cons to using rubrics. Obviously, some pros are clarity and transparency, as we've mentioned. Usually, when we use rubrics effectively, when we use them the right way, we do get improved student performance, especially because they know the expectations and they're able to strive for those expectations. Another pro, obviously, is targeted feedback. We can, pinpoint the areas of weakness that we need to work on. Of course, as we mentioned, enhanced self-assessment. It also provides us with fairness and consistency, across the table. There is no room for subjectivity. All the kids know, I have to do this in order to get this grade. You can't, give one student a grade different from another one's when they obviously are doing completing the same standard of excellence descriptors. And then, of course, with the communication and collaboration is enhanced, and that's an obvious pro. It's obviously a good thing. Now, some cons, however, are that it takes quite a bit of time to actually make good rubrics. However, I can show you some tricks by using AI to make our rubrics a lot faster, and then all we have to do is go in and tweak them a little bit. Sometimes they can be oversimplified. This is, I don't think anymore, but a con used to be that they, they could be a little bit oversimplified, and there's no real distinction between an excellent and a satisfactory. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference between those two levels of achievement. So a lot of times it can lead to teacher dependence. They would depend on the rubrics more than allowing some subjectivity to come into play, because of course we do want some subjectivity. We want that room to be able to make decisions based on a student rather than on a mold, because some students, when they're able to finally say their ABCs, is a big deal, whereas with other kids, reading a book ends up being a big deal, but they're in the same grade. So sometimes teachers become too dependent on just saying, no, the kid belongs in this box right here. Well, even though we're making tables and putting descriptors and things in boxes, we don't want to put the kids in a box. Okay, so be careful with that. And then, of course, it has a potential for student anxiety. Some students get too anxious when they can't reach a particular descriptor level, standard of excellence. They get, I got to do this. This is what I'm required to do. And they kind of freak out. So that comes to mental health issues with students. Just be on the lookout. If you're going to use rubrics, just be on the lookout for students who get anxious about it and just help them through it. We can prevent anxiety. All these things actually can be fixed. Any con can be overcome. Starting with time investment, as I said, I'll show you how to use AI to help with doing these things in a matter of minutes instead of days, and the other things. Oversimplification doesn't occur anymore with the use of AI, and of course, the flexibility. That's up to you, of course, with your flexibility and dependence. Okay. Now, overall, while rubrics have several potential drawbacks, the benefits outweigh any of the drawbacks. You know, when it comes to the rubrics, make sure that you can take, the design, you can take a rubric and you have what it could be for a particular outcome, but make sure that in each grade, in each class that you have, because remember, not all students are the same, you can change them. You don't have to apply them across the board. You have, as a teacher, the authority to manipulate rubrics to suit your students. Okay, so. All right, what are the key components of a rubric? Who can tell me? What are some key components of a rubric? Some of the key components are, one, is that we have alignment with learning objectives or learning outcomes. Okay, as mentioned already tonight, we align them with our learning outcomes. Okay, so we start with a rubric. Where does the rubric have its foundation? Where does it begin? It begins with connecting it to a learning objective or a learning outcome. So we have those lists of learning outcomes that I sent you. That's why I sent those to you, is so that you can use them in order to help you develop your assessment programs. Because one of the biggest failures that we have as teachers is that we go through and we think that we are supposed to teach a book. And I'm telling you over and over again, we are not here to teach books. We teach students. And how do we know if we're teaching the students? We assess. How do we assess? Well, one of the ways that we assess is by using rubrics. How do we build our rubrics? We have to start with outcomes. Okay, so even though the outcomes are the end result, they are the beginning of the class. Okay, so we start by connecting the rubrics to the specific outcomes that we want to assess, and we build from there going forward. And then we refine the rubric based on the chosen objectives and make sure that every criterion and performance level directly reflects the targeted skills and knowledge. So we start with the outcomes, we write our rubrics, we use other key components while we're writing our rubrics, but then after we get done, we have to go back and look at them again. This is the second part here, and refine it to make sure that we are actually reaching what we are striving to reach. Okay? So the next thing is the clear and measurable criteria, which comes from those clear and measurable objectives. Remember those verbs? So we identify the key aspects of the task or performance, and then we divide them into manageable categories, and then we also want to avoid excessive or too few criteria. So we have to be careful. What do we actually, what are the steps? When we want to reach goals, we have to take steps in order to reach those goals. It's the same thing with rubrics. It's the same thing with achieving these outcomes or objectives that we want to achieve for a particular skill. Well, we have to take steps in order to get there. Okay? And then each criterion should be clearly defined using concise and objective language. We don't want to use subjective terms such as good or creative. We should focus on observable characteristics. So, as I've told you multiple times before, it's what can a student do? What can we see, hear? Well, if they're in a cooking class, taste. What are the things that we can observe by using our senses? Okay. And then, of course, ensuring that the criteria are specific and measurable, as always. So, as I've told you before, I don't like the word understanding. They should be able to demonstrate understanding, so you can actually see that they can understand. So how are they going to demonstrate that understanding? Well, that's what comes after that. And then correctly identifies. Instead of using understanding of concept, use something like correctly identifies and explains, and then pinpointing it a little bit further, something like 3 key features of the concept, etc. So one of the things, like for writing, for example, has excellent spelling, only misspells up to 3 words in the out of 100, something like this. And then, of course, we have our descriptive performance levels. These are also called your standards of excellence. So we establish these by using, we can use maybe 3 to 5 criterion, and then the levels should represent a range of mastery from exceeding expectations to needing improvement, something along these lines. As we covered already. And then for each level, provide detailed descriptors. Those are the things that go in the box in the middle. These descriptors, what do they have to do in order to reach that level of achievement, the performance level. And then, of course, ensuring the performance levels are mutually exclusive. There should not be any overlapping, because then, of course, we run into trouble of, well, you gave me a 5 here, why didn't I get a 5 here? It's the same thing. Obviously we want to prevent that. So make sure that they are mutually exclusive. Each are individual. You fall into this category here, it's clear. There's no overlap. Okay. And then, of course, we want to make sure that the levels are appropriate. So we match the complexity of the rubric to the developmental level of the students and the difficulty of the task. Remember that if it's too simple, they are not challenged, they get bored, and they don't want to really participate. And then, of course, if it's too complex, they think, well, I can't do it, so why am I going to care? So you want to be able to, that's why I said that no matter what the rubric is, make sure that you change it to match your class, match your students. And then, of course, you start with the simpler rubric for introductory tasks and then gradually increase the complexity as the students progress. So, you don't want it to remain the same all the time. You want to increase the challenging level because, of course, as I said, they can get bored. You know that. And then, of course, make sure that they are transparent and accessible. You want to share your rubrics with your students. Once you do your rubrics, you say you're going to use rubrics for specific outcomes. Well, share those with the students and let them know. When we talk about the projects and presentation rubrics tomorrow, if you do projects and presentations, make sure that you share the rubrics as a part of the project package. So here's your task and here's how you're going to be graded. And that way they can ask questions from the very beginning and, move on from there. And then, of course, you can translate your rubrics into other languages if the students don't understand the language. But I'll talk a little bit more about language with rubrics in a little bit. But you can translate them if your students are having trouble understanding them in English. So, and then, of course, any students with disabilities, ADHD, they have trouble focusing on reading for a while. You can read them to them and go over them. So just make sure the kids understand them. That's, what that comes down to. Don't just give them to them and say, this is how you're going to be graded. Make sure they understand, okay? And give them time to ask questions. So some tips. First of all, make sure you pilot the rubric with small groups of students, and then you try it with them. And if you find where you need to make any changes, don't be afraid to make changes. They're your rubrics, okay? And then make sure you regularly review and update your rubrics as needed. Again, change them, modify them to meet your students. And then collaborate with your colleagues. Don't be afraid to ask your colleagues if you know um, if they can review your rubrics for you, and get their feedback. You know, work together. This seems to be one of the biggest failings that we have in almost every school I've ever been to. No, this is my work and I'm not sharing it. Well, forget that. You're in the 21st century, my friends. So here's a detailed guide. First of all, we want to identify our learning objectives and curriculum standards. Start by clearly defining the specific learning objectives that you want to assess. Again, I gave you that whole list of outcomes. We're going to use one of those here in a minute. So as far as your learning objectives, I keep saying objectives and outcomes, but I gave you the outcomes. With those outcomes, there are objectives that are included. And then within each of those, you can make even more detailed objectives in order to reach those outcomes. Okay, so remember, the outcomes is what we want at the end. Objectives are the steps in the process. Again, identify the relevant curriculum standards. As far as all of the outcomes that I gave you, I've already taken care of this part for you. The curriculum standards that we're using, that were used in order to come up with all of your outcomes, again, were the Common Core State Standards, the Next Generation Science Standards, and the National Social Studies Standards. So all that stuff is already done for you. You don't have to worry about that. They are aligned already. So you can just move past that. And then, of course, analyze the learning objectives and curriculum standards. So as you look at them, what do they mean? Again, I kind of did that for you already. And I was able to, put everything into like those 10 categories of outcomes as clearly as possible. So again, most of that is already done for you, but if you were to do it on your own, remember, you want to start with the standards that you have to fulfill. They could be government standards. No matter where you are and what you're doing, just make sure that that's where you start. Okay. So and you analyze them and figure out what exactly they're asking, and then look for commonalities and connections between the different ones. This will help you create cohesive rubric that addresses multiple learning goals simultaneously. This I did for you as well. That's why you have those 10 instead of the hundreds that each state standard has. I don't know if it's hundreds, but it's definitely dozens and dozens. But of course, I broke them down into those 10 for you because I was able to find the commonalities and just piece them together for you. So again, that's already done. But if you have to do it on your own, remember to do that part. And then develop the rubric criteria. So based on your analysis, determine the key criteria your rubric will assess. Each criterion should directly reflect a specific aspect of learning outcome. So with these criterion, this is where you're going to use your measurable objectives. Okay. So ensure the criterion are clear, concise, avoid vague language such as good or creative, use student-friendly language, and observable verbs like identifies, explains, solves. Again, when we say this, identifies, explains, or solves, what are those? Well, those are measurable objective verbs, right? We can actually measure them. We can see them, right? And then we want to aim for a balance between the number of criteria to avoid overload or oversimplification. So you don't want to just have 2 criteria for something. Like I mentioned already, 3 to 5 is typically a good number of criterion. But of course, don't just come up with a criterion just to fill in a blank. If you find that you can only come up with 2 criterion for a specific learning outcome, then it's time to talk with colleagues or do an internet search or something, because there should be more. Usually, if you find too many, right? Usually, you come across where you actually have to try to reduce them, see how you can combine some of them. But I've never run into where you can't find enough criterion. And then, of course, you want to define your performance levels. So step 4, define your performance levels. At what level do we want to find mastery? So usually you start out with, exceeds expectations, and the last one is needs improvement, and what are 2 or 3 things in the middle, whatever we're going to call them. Okay. For each level, provide detailed descriptors. Make sure that your descriptors, separate, are clearly separated from each other, so that there's no overlap. You want to make sure that, when you explain or give these rubrics to your students, that you can perhaps show them some examples of what this work is. With English, with writing, for example, it's really easy to do because usually teachers have a plethora of things that students have done before. And, but if you don't, and you're building rubrics, just save some, photocopy some work of kids so that you can use that as examples later. Of course, removing names so that nobody gets embarrassed, but save some writing that matches the different descriptors. Okay, because it's easier to show examples. And then, of course, ensure the performance levels are mutually exclusive. They are individual. It's easy to identify them from each other. Okay. Number 5, the 5th step is to use evidence of alignment. And of course, I've already done this for you. It's going to be easy for you if you make rubrics from your outcomes. You just put the outcome at the top, and it's aligned. It shows that it's aligned. So your outcome, that if you're using the outcomes that I've given you, this is already done for you, this step. And then, of course, consider demonstrating alignment visually by color coding or bracketing criteria that map to specific learning outcomes or curriculum standards. And then, of course, you want to pilot, test, and review. The first time you use them is going to be the time that you pilot, test, and review. So you can, if you're going to do a project or a presentation or a writing assignment or a math project or whatever the case may be, and you're using a rubric, well, if you're doing it the first time this year, this is your pilot, year. So what I would suggest that you do, though, is that don't get hung up on, using that rubric strictly. Make sure that you are flexible in applying the grading system. Okay. And then, of course, as you keep your rubrics, you should actually build a portfolio of rubrics that you use so that you can regularly review and update them and, change them to the student needs. And then, of course, as you learn different pedagogical approaches, you can change things as well. Okay. So some additional tips. Make sure you involve students in the rubric development. This usually comes when you use them, but get their feedback. Share the rubric with them. Get their feedback on them. As they ask questions, maybe you need to tweak the descriptors. If they're not understanding what you're asking them to do, change it. It's not a big deal. But involving them in the process definitely helps. Okay. Consider using different rubric formats, such as the analytic, the holistic, or the developmental, to suit the different learning tasks and assessment goals, of course. And then make sure you ensure accessibility by translating if need be. You don't have to, just, if your kids are having trouble understanding the, English, well, translate it into their language so they get it. Or perhaps their parents aren't very good at English. Maybe you want to translate it so that their parents can understand it. But, I know you're busy. Maybe you don't have time to do that sort of thing. It's just an idea. Okay. So let's design one together, shall we? You ready? Of course you are. Going with the 7th grade mathematics learning outcomes, mastering algebraic foundations is the main outcome that we're going for. We want our students to master algebraic foundations. So how do they do that? Well, we have 4 sub outcomes. One is deepen understanding of variables, expressions, and equations. Another one is solve linear equations and inequalities, blah, blah, blah. Another is translate real-world situations into mathematical equations and inequalities, and introduce concepts of functions and their representations. Now, if I wanted to do all of these things at the same time to be on one rubric, I would use holistic. Now, if I use a holistic rubric for all of these things, for the mastering of algebraic foundations, would that help me to develop the students to be able to pinpoint areas of improvement? Would it help me do that? Let's use an analytic. With this, we'll just use the first one. We'll use Mastering Algebraic Foundations A, Deepen Understanding of Variables, Expressions, and Equations. We'll just separate that one sub-outcome into its own rubric, and we will use Analytic Rubric for this one. We want to analyze each of the different steps or each of the different objectives within our outcome. So we're going to use analytic, and analytic works very well for math and science, by the way. It works for all of them, but developmental is better for social studies and English, to be quite honest, because of the different types of tasks that are being asked of the students. But analytic is quite good for math. So with step 1, of course, we want to identify the clear and measurable criteria. So, of course, aligning with the learning objectives, we have kind of done this. We want to focus on observable aspects, of course. We want to break them down into sub-criteria, and we want to use very specific language. All of these things help us in identifying the clear and measurable criteria. So with step, in order to be able to do that, we remember Bloom's taxonomy. And remember, with Bloom's taxonomy, we want to use the revised version, which is from 2001 onward. So from the 2001 Bloom's taxonomy, we have remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. As you can see on the screen, we have different words that we can use, different measurable objectives, measurable verbs, such as with remember, we have define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, state. So we use this language in our rubrics in order to be able to let students know that this is what we are observing and this is how we are observing it. Now, also, when you're making a rubric, remember that depending on the level of your students, you'll want to include these different steps. And I'm talking again mainly about the analytic ones at this point, but you would, like your first category at the top would be to remember something. So define this. Define what an algebraic expression is, as an example. For English, you could say define, these words. And then what would come next? Well, we would want them to apply, perhaps. So for English, as example, use the words that you have defined in sentences. Okay? And then, of course, evaluate or create, going, even further. So try to use, and this is where you would come up with your 3 to 5 different criterion, because you could have a remember and apply and evaluate. Those are 3 things. You could have a remember, understand, and analyze. Those 3. So here, this is already laid out for you. When you want to, if you're questioning, well, where do I get the 3 to 5 criterion for? Well, you got all 6 of them right here in front of you. So you don't want to use all of them. obviously, but choose 3 to 5 of them and then go from there. Okay, and you could even do remember twice if you want to. You want them to define this and then list this, in the same rubric. It's okay to do that. Just don't make it all remember. You want to make sure that you do some kind of scaffolded improvement or scaffolded skill accomplishment. Okay. So as far as building your rubric goes, again, as far as your criterion goes, you have right here 6 different choices that you can make in order to make your criterion. Okay. Easy peasy, right? Okay, and then of course we're using deepening understanding of variables, expressions, and equations. So the first thing that we have for our rubric is understand. So with our understand, we want them to explain the difference between expressions and equations using correct terminology. Very good. So my next thing is I want them to apply. What do I want them to apply? I want them to simplify expressions by combining like terms and applying order of operations. Cool. And then the third thing I want them to do, to keep it simple, is to analyze. I want them to identify and explain the different parts of an equation. Yes, it says identify, but explain the different parts of an equation. So even though identify goes way back with, the understand part, the explain is where you have analyze. So now we have our 3 different criterion, right? And then we put those in our box over on the left. See? So when it comes to, what our outcome is, the outcome is at the very top on, deepen understanding of variables, expressions, and equations. Our criteria over on the left. And then for this example, we can use exceeding expectations, meeting expectations, approaching expectations, and not yet meeting expectations. So instead of just having excellent and satisfactory, again, those kind of are a little subjective they sound subjective, even though the descriptors would make it not subjective, it sounds subjective. So if we use things like exceeding expectations, meeting expectations, etc., then this takes away all subjectivity. Okay. Now there are other options that we can use for this. We can use things such as some simple alternatives, and I'll give all this to you so you have tons of these performance indicators. One for surpassing all goals is achieving all learning objectives, making significant progress, requiring additional support, something like this. So, and I'm not going to read all these to you because that would be really boring and you'd fall asleep. But here are a whole bunch of them. So here's some simple alternatives that I'll share with you. Here is action-oriented alternatives, things like going above and beyond, contributing new ideas, exceeding goals, or demonstrating exceptional creativity. One of those is reaching all targets, making notable progress, requiring additional practice, and then with some further explanations. So, there's all kinds of different levels of standards of excellence that you can use. And then one more is something more descriptive, such as the highest level of achievement is demonstrating remarkable creativity, insight, and innovation, solid mastery, demonstrating clear understanding, developing proficiency, and learning in progress. So there are tons of different things that you can use, and I'll share these with you. So all you have to do is pick, for each row they go together. Okay, so if you decide to use any particular row, use the whole row, or only eliminate one. I don't know which one that you would eliminate, but use the whole row. Don't mix and match them. They're designed in these rows for a reason. You have tons of those that you can use, but no matter what you use, make sure that each level represents a different degree of mastery of the criterion. Make sure that you have a mutually exclusive, okay? And then use concrete examples, illustrate each level. When you're going over the rubrics with the students, make sure that you can show them what, an example of that particular level is, even if you have to invent something. And then, of course, make sure that you explain the rubric before using it. Don't just all of a sudden, ask your students to do something and then give them a grade based on a rubric that they've never seen. That's kind of rude. I know none of you would do that. So, but I have to put it in there anyways. So we're ready for step 6. And step 5, of course, was making sure that you reference the outcome. And of course, we did that at the top of our table. So step 6, of course, is making sure that you go over it with the students and getting their feedback. Get their feedback and make changes before you implement it. Okay, very important. This is what our rubric looks like. We have deepened understanding of variables, expressions, and equations. Over on the left, we have our criteria. We have our understand, apply, and analyze categories. And then we have exceeds expectations, meets expectations, and needs improvement. And you can read through these in order to be able to see what the descriptors are. And if you look at the descriptors, they're all the same. And the only reason why they're all the same in this rubric is because they apply. You can apply all of these in these boxes. So, provides insightful explanations beyond basic definitions, demonstrating a deeper grasp of concepts. Yeah, you can do that in all of these different areas. Now, when it comes to this particular rubric, however, this could be a little difficult. And even with parents too, if you want to share it with parents, they would read it and they'd be like, whatever, this is just mumbo jumbo. And they would just dismiss it. What we want to do is we want to change the language. We have to make the language age and grade appropriate. So for this one, this is what we are asking the students to do. So when we want to put it into the language that they will understand, this is what we end up with. So variable master understands and uses variables. Exceeds expectations is explains beyond unknown things, uses cool symbols like X and Y. The 7th grader will understand that, right? When it comes to making our rubrics, we can make it as fancy as we want, but at the end of the day, we have to change the language to make sure that our students understand it. And if they take this home and they share it with their parents will understand it. So a lot of our parents are pretty smart, but they don't understand when we just fill in a whole bunch of boxes with a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. We have to make the language appropriate for the audience. Unless we're just using the rubric as the grading and just saying, okay, this is, that would be formative assessment, right? But when it comes to being able to enter numbers into our spreadsheets or whatever we're using for our grading system, we have to use numbers. Now, when you look at this, though, you see exceeding expectations is 90 to 100%. Well, now I have some subjectivity. And at what point, where is my 95? Well, you as the teacher, you're allowed a certain amount of subjectivity. If the students are exceeding expectations and if they're just barely exceeding the expectations, well, it's a 90. If they're extraordinarily exceeding those expectations, well, it's 100. And then any place in between. And then as far as the meeting expectations, 75 to 89, etc. So you have some room for, you have some wiggle room in there. And this is where you can apply these numbers according to the student, the individual student, their capabilities. Because some students, are just crazy extraordinary. And then other students, they struggle with everything. And then, just celebrating those small achievements is really important. Right. So, and of course, this part isn't perfect. Another way you could do it is to assign just numbers. So you could assign a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. You could do it like that. And then on your spreadsheet, you would have, your rubric grades. So that if you have a series of rubrics that you're using 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s on, and then at the end of the marking term, you take the average, or you count them up and then convert that number out of 100%, or however you want to do it. There's multiple ways that you can do it, but this is just one idea. Another idea, like I said, is to make them 4, 3, 2, and 1, and then add up your rubrics and then take them out of 100. So there are different ways, but or like I said, you can also just use it as a rubric grade for formative assessment, especially with the developmental ones. So if you're using developmental, then you're saying, okay, we need to work on this, because it's not really a graded thing. Next thing is make sure that when we're designing our rubrics, we balance complexity and practicality. So of course, keep it simple, including the language. Like I said, you can develop your rubric as complicated as you want, but at the end of the day, you want to bring it down. Keep it simple. So, and the more you do it, actually, the easier it becomes, and the more you recognize the language that you have to use. And of course, the language that you use is different according to the grade that you're using. So make sure that you consider your grade level, obviously. And then, of course, allow for differentiation. Again, this is where that subjectivity comes in. You know that, these two students are different, but according to their capabilities, they both deserve, a particular score. Okay. And then, of course, make sure we use measurable verbs. Refer back to Bloom's taxonomy. Make sure that we try to avoid subjectivity as much as possible, of course, and then use parallel language. In other words, use language that's similar in level. Don't make like one criterion or descriptor really complicated language, then another one really simple language. Make sure that the language is all, fairly equal. And then make sure that you pilot, test, and revise your rubrics. Nothing is perfect at the beginning, at least that I'm aware of.